This is the story of the world on the brink of economic disaster.
The most intense period in the crisis was that period in the fall of 2008.
There was an extraordinary loss of confidence, a panic, I would call it.
The state of the financial markets was very critical indeed. It would be for others to judge just how on the edge many institutions were.
A crisis that had been triggered by the collapse of Lehman Brothers Bank was now spreading to every country in the world.
Financial institutions, banks, bankers, traders were at a loss. And they were not only holding out their hand, but also, turning to us to say, what are we going to do? We need help.
No government was ready for the consequences. This is the inside account of the arguments, mistakes and hesitations that dramatically worsened the crisis.
I did not feel that we would be dumb enough to let the misfunction of the financial engine bring down the country. But there was a time there where you wondered about that.
Now, decision makers in the world's capitals tell how close we really came to total financial meltdown.
I know the counterfactual is very hard to prove, but it does make my blood run cold.
We literally thought that we were on the verge of the Great Depression, and looking back, I think we probably were.
I was in no doubt that the burden on our shoulders, that the gravity of the task we faced, and it is probably the worst situation, as I say, we faced in peacetime.
September is hurricane season in America. On Monday the 15th, Texas took stock of the damage caused by the latest, Hurricane Ike. These storms are devastating, but not unusual. What was unexpected was the scale of economic disaster that was coming.
This is really stupendous this has happened.
That same day, Lehman Brothers Bank went bust. It was the start of a month when the world came within hours of catastrophe.
With more on this, a lot of people expected it, and there were others who were just simply devastated. There was some classic losses.
This is an event like a hurricane. It's unanticipated. I don't think any of us were smart enough to see it, and, that's unfortunate.
It was the biggest bankruptcy in history. It sent stock markets into a nosedive and the media into a frenzy.
Something of a financial hurricane.
A financial tsunami.
One of the ugliest days I have ever seen.
Quelle répercussion aura la faillite de la banque Lehman Brothers sur la finance mondiale?
Nightmare on Wall Street. Very, very bad.
Deutsche Bank mit einem Minus von 5,6%, Commerzbank ein Minus von 5,3%.
Day of turmoil on the world's financial markets.
The two capitals of international finance were especially hard hit. In New York, the Dow fell a record 504 points. The FTSE lost £51 billion in value. The dramatic numbers and anguished faces on Wall Street and the city were the obvious effect. But the events set in motion that day would have an impact far beyond these financial districts. The amount banks charged each other for short-term loans doubled overnight. That meant they couldn't afford to borrow money. Banks lost confidence in banks.
The essence of a bank is confidence. If people don't have complete confidence in a bank, the bank will not be able to borrow the funds which it needs to lend to others in business or to families. So that confidence was at threat, and after the failure of Lehman Brothers, it ebbed away very quickly.
It was the Lehman's collapse that really burst the dam that had been building up all summer.
A 20-year global boom was over. All summer, banks around the world had been hemorrhaging money. But Lehman Brothers was the first to go.
Lehman's failure made things dramatically worse, but coming into the fall, you had a global financial crisis that was getting accelerating momentum, had tremendous force at that point, and that's what's ultimately caused that failure. Lehman made things worse, though. There's no doubt about that.
That Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday were really a blur for me because we were all working so hard, looking at every tool we had, seeing where the fires were.
Dozens of institutions were in trouble. The man running US economic policy during the crisis was Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson. He seemed to change America's policy day by day. He had just refused to bail out Lehman Brothers, but a week earlier spent $200 billion nationalizing America's huge mortgage holding companies. He spent $30 billion in March to save a bank called Bear Stearns.
I can finish up the briefing.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I hope you all had an enjoyable weekend.
No wonder the public was confused.
Yes, you're right.
Why did you agree to support the bailout of Bear Stearns but not Lehman?
Yeah, the situation in March and the situation and the facts around Bear Stearns were very, very different to the situation we are looking at here in September. And I never once considered that it was appropriate to put taxpayer money on the line in resolving Lehman Brothers.
But a day later, Tuesday the 16th, the policy changed again. The government spent $85 billion saving insurance giant AIG.
Such as hedge fund SAC Capital. The paper also
if the policymakers didn't seem to know what to do, how could the public hope to understand the complexities of banking and bailouts now coming at them?
And if I may, a sincere congratulations to everybody out there who pays taxes in the United States. We just bought an insurance company! Congratulations! AIG, we own 80% of the world's biggest insurance company now, causing day 3 of the nationwide outbreak of huge banner newspaper headlines nobody understands. Oh my God, that giant number is attacking that 3-letter acronym.
It was like a slow-moving train wreck. On Monday morning, lots of people woke up and said, well, that's not so bad. By Wednesday, the money market complex was under threat, and suddenly people realized this is something we're going to be talking to our kids and our grandkids for a long, long time.
What happened on Wednesday, 3 days into the crisis, was unprecedented in modern times. The lubricant of the economy, the stable flow of US dollars, froze. And not just in America.
They said that there were trillions and trillions of dollars crossing the ocean, and suddenly these dollars disappeared. You no longer had credit in the world, and this had, even in Brazil, disastrous consequences.
Lending between banks had already shut down, and big businesses, like banks, also need to borrow large amounts of money for very short periods. They use a kind of special IOU called commercial paper. By Wednesday, the Lehman's aftershock was closing the commercial paper market.
We had been witnessing for the last 2 days a sequential freezing of market after market, deemed to be absolutely critical to the functioning of the capitalist system. I remember picking up the phone and saying, Jamie, drop what you're doing, go to the ATM, and take money out. Take the maximum $500 we can. And she said, why? I said, because I'm not sure the banks will be open tomorrow.
I closed all my savings bank accounts today because I'll earn more with Lincoln Money Market Savings. Now I can do all my banking at Lincoln.
Since the 1980s, Americans have been encouraged to put their savings in money market funds.
Lincoln's new Money Market Savings.
If today's stock markets had these funds then lent this cash to banks and big businesses.
Number one.
Lehman Brothers have been a key player in this trade. It collapsed, owing almost $800 million to a money market fund called the Reserve Primary. Caught short of cash as a result, the Reserve Primary told its depositors they would lose money.
It's something that the textbooks just never contemplate, which is the most safe and secure assets, having market participants look at them and say these are not safe and therefore we are not going to touch them.
Depositors withdrew $300 billion from the money market funds. It threatened huge companies that rely on short-term loans for their day-to-day cash flow.
There was an enormous amount of fear and anxiety as to what we were going to do because
money market mutual funds are one of the biggest providers of cash to all these large institutions in the country and essentially in the world.
It all happened incredibly fast. By Wednesday, only 3 days into the crisis, credit for any institution, large or small, was unavailable. The crisis had entered a new and dangerous phase.
Bank CEOs are calling and saying the interbank funding market is essentially seized up, something they've never seen before in their 40-year histories of being on the street.
Not just banks and commercial banks, we were getting calls from large American businesses, blue chip businesses, saying they couldn't fund themselves, they couldn't make their payroll, they couldn't fund their inventory. These are some of the best American companies that have very little to do with financial markets, saying they can't access the basic funding they need to pay their employees.
I would say it's fair to say there's a lot of panic.
That's when we knew the time had come.
For the first 3 days after Lehman Brothers fell, governments had responded to problems as they came up. The UK's banks had been suffering since the fall of Northern Rock a year earlier.
Lehman's accelerated the process. We knew that we had banks collapsing around the world. We knew that we had very little time.
The next to go was HBOS. On Wednesday, the government stepped in to help broker its sale to Lloyds TSB for £12 billion.
There was no confidence within the system now that people knew exactly what was wrong with each individual bank. Did you not have to go further than that?
Gordon Brown and his city advisor, Baroness Vadera, saw Britain might have to take on the job of rescuing the financial system. Their plan, when it came, would profoundly alter the story. But America got there first. The problem facing banks everywhere were huge bundles of mortgages they bought and traded during the boom. These were the so-called toxic assets. Banks borrowed money to buy them. It's called leverage.
They increase leverage dramatically in a way that people can't even measure, either as to individual institutions or as to the system, but it's dramatic nevertheless.
Leverage does increase profits in good times, but leverage also worsens losses. When property prices crashed, so did the value of these assets. But they were so complex, it was almost impossible for the banks to price them or sell them off. And banks all over the world had huge loans that still had to be paid.
Banks couldn't raise enough money. Because they couldn't raise enough money, they had to sell some assets. They sold those assets, asset prices went down, had to sell some more assets because they lost some capital, and so it went on.
They hadn't got enough capital, they hadn't got enough liquidity, and they were also having difficulty raising funds.
So, by late on Wednesday afternoon, 3 days after Lehman fell, the US Treasury decided to tackle the problem head-on.
We really came up with four main options. So one was to buy the assets, so buy the toxic assets from the banks. The second was to insure the assets. The third was to actually just inject capital to buy stakes in financial firms directly. And then the fourth was, let's just bail out all the homeowners.
The problem with all these options was the price tag. All would cost over $500 billion, and they needed the support of the president and legal authority from the US Congress.
There was a conference call to discuss these options. It must have been at 1 or 2 in the morning, so as Wednesday night turned into Thursday morning.
On that Thursday morning, the 18th of September, Paulson and his Treasury team decided to ask the president to support a plan to buy the toxic assets from the banks. That afternoon, they went to the White House.
The president was less interested in what does the plan exactly look like. He was more interested in what are the broad strokes of the authority you need? Why do we need this authority?
We were in that situation right then. The question is, should we take action, which after the fact might have been unnecessary and might create some problems down the road, or should we simply not take action, hope that things work out, but if they don't, and we end up in the Great Depression, the costs of having gone